Welcome to the Opengear How-To Video Series. This video on serial configuration is presented by Mitch Densley, Principal Solutions Architect. In this video, we're going to talk about the purposes for setting up serial ports and what you'd use them for. We'll review the documentation that goes into greater detail about serial port configuration. We'll talk about the defaults so that you know what to expect out of the box, and then what your options are as far as customizing that configuration. We'll talk about the Autodiscovery feature and how it could help you with the configuration. We'll talk about serial port logging and the benefits and use of that, as well as how you then launch serial port sessions from the WebUI, from Lighthouse, from the CLI, via SSH, and then finally using an insecure approach of Telnet. So first off, what is a serial port and why would you ever want to connect to one? Well, serial ports or serial consoles are often the lowest level of administrative access that IT equipment provide. You can see in the Palo Alto Networks firewall, kind of in the bottom of the image here, there are two ports labeled console. One is an RJ45 that is an RS-232 port. The other is a USB micro port. Both can be used for accessing the same serial console of the appliance, and both can be connected to an Opengear appliance via a serial port or a USB port. The type of sessions can be provided using SSH, which would be recommended. That stands for Secure Shell. Alternatively, you could use the web interface to launch a live terminal session using an HTML5 interface. And then we do support Telnet, however, it is not advised due to the fact that Telnet traffic is clear text, meaning there is zero encryption, zero protection for that traffic. And so even though it does work and has historically worked for decades, it is not recommended due to weak security. So serial sessions are used by IT administrators or operations staff when they need to set up a piece of IT equipment for the very first time, typically network switches, network routers, network firewalls, but not limited to those. It also includes servers, storage, UPSs, PDUs, any kind of device with a serial console port, whether that's RS-232 DB9, RS-232 RJ45, or USB, or even interfaces that have an IP management console can be used to set up those devices, but those are not representative of serial sessions. Serial sessions are a command line driven type of interface and often used for initial setup as well as low-level debugging and troubleshooting when IP connectivity is failing due to switching loops, routing loops, IP conflict. Any issue, any number of issues can prevent an IP session from being successful, where serial sessions are very straightforward, very simple, very reliable. And the only thing that would interfere with a serial session from being established is if the baud rate, the speed essentially, or the pinout is different between the console server on the left and the device on the right. As long as you've got the pinout, baud rate correct. Now there are some other parameters like parity and stop bits, etc. But generally those are less critical. But always check the documentation for the IT equipment you're connecting to make sure that you're configuring the Opengear serial port options appropriate for the type of device that you're connecting to. Documentation from Opengear first starts with the user guide. This is online. You can easily access this from ftp.opengear.com or portal.opengear.com looking for resources. We do have some very useful and very specific knowledge base articles. I wrote the number 2 on how to do direct to serial sessions for automation or scripting. So this is a session direct to a serial port and effectively bypasses the appliance's shell. So it's very convenient, very quick and easy to get into a serial session. Now, once you are in a serial session, there are some important keystrokes that you should be aware of. You can see the default ones listed here. for example, tilde B will generate a break. Tilde M will take you back to the pmshell menu. And then tilde dot will exit from a serial session altogether and drop you down to the appliance bash shell. If you're on a Mac or anything that uses OpenSSH, for reasons you'll need to be used to typing tilde 2 times in order for these shell commands and break sequences to take effect. When it comes to the configuration of a serial port, you can see the defaults shown, either the OG CLI defaults, I've kept this to just a single serial port, or the WebUI defaults. Now, you'll notice that they are largely the same but not identical. For example, these control codes are keystroke commands you could use, like Control-C, Control-Z, as long as that keystroke isn't used by the system in question or by your client for other things, you can assign it in the CLI to take the same behavior as some of the tilde commands that you saw on the previous screen. Other things you can see are like the database escape character. That's that tilde I mentioned earlier. It is changeable, and you can see that in both CLI WebUI. You can do things like assign IP aliases to a serial port, so you could SSH to that IP and be taken to that specific serial port. You can see that we've got the label for the port. So this is the name of the port or how it appears in the UI, whether that's the text UI, the command line UI, the web UI, etc. Logging level, we'll talk a little bit more about this later. The mode is either console server, disabled, or local console. Local console as an option is pretty neat because it lets you have more than one appliance console. There is the dedicated physical serial console port, but you can configure any of the other serial ports for local console so that multiple administrators can be accessing this appliance if it is, let's say, cascaded via serial beneath a parent upstream appliance. The number of local consoles that you configure allows for multiple users to be accessing independent consoles and doing independent sessions. Sessions can be shared if they're launched via IP to the appliance, but if you are doing some cascading or tiering where serial is the only connectivity between a parent and a child appliance, then the sharing is something that would only be applicable to the parent appliance, the appliance that's providing that SSH to serial or that Telnet to serial translation. A couple other things that are important to know are the port pinouts. So you can see by default the X2 pinout, as denoted here by the D, is the default for most of the Opengear appliances, and X2 is effectively a straight-through cable. If you're connecting to a device that requires, let's say, a pinout adapter or a rollover adapter, you can change the pinout in most Opengear appliances to X1 and not need an adapter because we've changed the pinout in software. And then I mentioned the logging piece. Logging is essentially the ability for the appliance to log all or what level of data, either transmitted data or received data from the console device that you're connected to. And we'll go into this a little bit more in detail later, but just note the default is logging is disabled, and the different options you can bump that up to. Autodiscovery is a feature that really makes operationalization of managing serial consoles easier in a dynamic environment. So let's say you're administering a lab, or you're in a ramp-up period for a data center or a remote site where there's a lot of change, aka a very dynamic environment. You can enable auto-discovery. You can do it manually via the WebUI with this button here. You can schedule it, which then produces this UI dialog down here in the lower right. And this would let you basically just schedule the running of the auto-discovery feature at a given day and time. The only options that the WebUI gives you for auto-discovery is, do you want to run it now or later, and do you want to supply some form of credentials? Think hard about the supplying of credentials here because these do go into the Opengear appliance config. And so these should be service account credentials, nothing that could ever be used as a user to interactively log into a device and do really anything. It should be a read-only type of account, just out of security reasons, right? So whatever credentials you supply here should be very restricted, read-only at most. That way, if ever these credentials leak because it's part of the Opengear config, that Opengear config could be stored in a backup repository. That backup repository, heaven forbid, if your security is weak in that area and it leaks, an attacker could only ever get read-only access given the credentials that are here. So my point being, just be judicious in what credentials you apply here. Do not supply some form of administrative root or super user credentials to the device that is connected to a given serial port. You can run the schedule on a per port basis, so or you can run the schedule for all ports collectively. Now, I hope, out of security, you are not using the same logon credentials for multiple devices, especially devices of different types. And that's why it would be wise to configure a schedule for each port where you can give it unique credentials. If you have a standard that says port 1 is always, let's say, a PDU, port 2 is always a firewall, port 3 is always a switch, etc., then you could predict what these schedules need to be. Or hypothetically, you could have some set of initial credentials, things that are only valid by design during initial ramp and stand-up timeframes. And once the facility goes into a production capacity, those credentials would then be removed and no longer valid. In which case, this would be perfect, and you could have the same set of credentials for multiple types of devices. It would only be used for discovery of brand new assets, and then part of your provisioning process would be to launch a serial session to that device, change said credentials to something more secure, and away you go, right? But one of the great things about Autodiscovery is it will detect that pinout, that baud rate, and the host name of the device that's connected. So you don't see 15 different devices that all look identical that have been connected. You should see 15 different, switch, router, PDU, etc. Now, if you're plugging 15 Cisco switches in at the same time, then it'll be port 1 through port 15 will all say Cisco switch, and it might be a little difficult to distinguish one from the next. But depending on how you're deploying and the scenario involved, Autodiscovery with the label harvesting could be really handy. Now, there are a few more options available to you if you choose to run the discovery feature from the command line of the Opengear. You can see here I've provided the syntax for invoking that. We call it port discovery in the CLI, Autodiscovery in the WebUI, just so that when I say one name or the other, you know effectively which I'm talking about, but this is just relative to the UI. The actual process that runs in the background is the same. This is a Python script, port discovery. So here you can see the usage for the script, the options you can provide, things like specific ports that you can reference. You can ask for the discovery status if it's running in the background. You can supply the credentials we talked about earlier. And then there's some other things that are pretty awesome, like setting timeouts for the hostname discovery, timeouts for the authentication piece, patterns for the regex to be supplied. This way you can identify maybe non-default host names and only represent those, whereas a default host name would be rejected out of hand. Really just comes down to the patterns you supply with the regex. And then you've also got the option to do a restore default labels. So in a very, very, very dynamic environment where things are not just added dynamically, but things are removed dynamically in the lab, then you can run the port discovery using cron so that it runs on a schedule, and you can invoke restore default labels. So if, let's say, this port 3 device is unplugged, the label here would revert at the next run of that script from IM7248, the rest, to port -3. So hopefully that explains how the restore default labels works. And then you can see just a few different examples of running port discovery with some of these options. Serial port logging is a feature and capability that is near and dear to my heart, and I really hope it's something that you will strongly consider enabling, not just to benefit yourself today, but future self, because if a security event or if an outage event or some kind of event happens and you're not actively connected to the device, let's say the device is not actively logging somewhere else, then it's very difficult to know exactly what happened after the fact. And much of the troubleshooting playbooks that companies employ have a methodology of try this, record your results, try this, record your results. So you're trying to figure out what happened. Whereas if you have serial port logging enabled, you get a actual transcript of what the device claimed happened. And if there was an operator in a session, then you get a transcript of what that operator made happen, in addition to what that same device also proclaimed to have happened via console messages. So the way the logging can work by default, logging is disabled, so both the TX stream and the RX stream logging is off. You can log for events only, so the TX stream is blocked, but the RX stream, we would log just console messages, so things that are produced by this device when a user is not in session. Now, I strongly recommend you enable events and received characters. This will capture log data whether there's a user session active or not, and it will only capture receive stream data. So not anything that the operator types, that would be in the TX stream, but everything that is echoed back to the console would come via the RX stream and would be logged. This is inclusive of commands that the operator typed, outputs that the operator saw. It would also include console messages the operator saw or didn't see. But what it will not capture are characters that are typed, just characters that are echoed back. If you have an issue with the events and received characters level of logging, then you can go one more level of detail lower, which is for all characters and all events. This will now log the TX stream. The reason we don't generally recommend this is it would capture potentially a password, something that an operator types in clear text that is then echoed back in obfuscated text. The clear text values would be logged as well as the echoed back obfuscated values, because you'd be logging the TX stream and the RX stream. So just keep in mind what is logged and when and where, depending on the option you choose. To view those logs, you have a few different places where you can go. In the appliance web interface, under the monitor tab at the top, it's typically collapsed. You need to hit the little arrow here to pop this down. Not under monitor, my mistake. You would probably think to look here, but it's not under monitor. It's actually in the access panel when you either have a session open or have had log data been created in the past. You will then see this option here to view the port log. And when you do so, it opens a new browser tab and shows you the data that has been captured. And it also shows you which stream the data was captured from. So you can see RX data. Because mine is set to both log the events and all received characters. You can view the log data from also the CLI or the shell of the appliance. And so under the var log directory where most logs are captured, messages would be the appliance's logs, and then you'd have port-specific log files under var log that you could open up and view for a given port. Now this will be just the port number, not the label or any other designation, so the port number. Additionally, you can go into the syslog server settings for the appliance, and you can enable sending of serial port logs via syslog. So you could have a team centrally consume this log data and not need to manually log into the appliance to see the serial port logs. And here you can see a few different ways. I'm just using Graylog as a syslog server. I'm currently filtering for the console, but if you were to go recreate this, I would recommend a filter of, let's say, RX data, because that would be inclusive of this specific port as well as other ports. So this would be an RX data filter, would narrow down on all that serial port log data. Now, it does come across as a specific facility number, so if you do want to break out data based on facility or logging level in the syslog server, you can do that as well. To access a serial port, you've got a variety of options. First off, if you're in the web interface for the appliance under the Access tab here on serial ports, you will see on the right-hand side, kind of in the table, there are these two buttons to access. First, the web terminal, which opens a new browser tab and gives you this web interface, HTML5, live viewer to that specific device. And you can see I'm just on my Palo firewall, and I've shown our ball, and you can see the results. You can also use this other option here, right, the second option in the UI, and this will prompt your browser to download a connection string and whatever the operating system sees as the default SSH client will be launched when you click on this SSH button here. One thing to know, when you do this SSH option, it will use your logged on username to the Opengear appliance as the username to launch the SSH session to the appliance to the serial port. So when you do that, just make sure that the username you're using is appropriate. Now, this will become more relevant when we look at this from the context of Lighthouse on our next slide, but just keep in mind credentials matter between the appliance and the central manager. And then depending on the type of serial session you launch, the credentials might even need to persist through to the end device. So central authentication is wise. Things like Radius, TACACS, LDAP-S, SAML for Lighthouse as well. One last thing I'll mention when it comes to serial sessions, by default, all serial sessions are inherently shared so that multiple operators can launch sessions simultaneously to a common serial port, interact and see the same thing as each other, unless in the serial configuration you choose to disable sharing, in which case a session would be locked to the first operator who launched the session. From the Lighthouse Lighthouse Central Manager, you can see down here you've got a table of ports that represent the serial ports from all appliances that are managed by this central manager. The central manager calls appliances nodes, and so when you go to click on the web terminal, it does open again in another browser and takes you to that serial session. And if you go to use the SSH option, it does prompt the OS to open an SSH client, and the credentials used for that SSH session are the ones used to log into Lighthouse. So in order for that to succeed, you would need the same username on both the appliance or the node as well as the Lighthouse Central Manager. Again, centralized remote authentication is prescribed here for ease of use, consistency of connectivity. It is also recommended that you have a break glass or an emergency use administrative account that is not remote, that is local to Lighthouse, that is local to the appliances, and that account should not be used under normal circumstances. It should be an account that is only authorized for use when central remote authentication is down for whatever reason, okay? And you should be alerting on whenever that local account is used so that you can treat the password that was assigned as a burner, ephemeral effectively, and go change that password after it was used. to something that is, again, secure and safe. Also, from the appliance native shell, you can open up this interactive terminal pmshell, which gives you a menu of the ports and their labels and gives you the option to connect to them by typing in the port number. So if I wanted to connect to, let's say, port 6, I would not have to type pan PA 440 console. I could just type the number 6 and it would connect me to that serial port. Again, remember the hotkeys for use while you're in that session. So if you happen to have a PDU outlet associated with the serial port, you could do ~P and you could issue power control commands via the PDU to cycle the outlets that serial port 6, let's say, is connected to. Or I could use ~M to jump back out to this pmshell menu, or ~. To exit entirely. And again, if you're on a Mac, don't forget ~, twice. If you want to SSH directly to a port, this greatly simplifies, well, not greatly, it takes out a step, if you will. So if I just need to quickly get into a given serial port, maybe it's one I use very often, I can access that port by a TCP reference. So we allocate 3001 through 3000, let's say 58. The numerical last digit or last 2 digits represent the numerical serial ports, including the USB serial ports of the appliance. So 3001 would be serial port 1, 3048 would be serial port 48, and 3057 would be the second to last USB port on an OM2224, for example. So I think that's the right reference. Anyway, the point is we allocate TCP numerical values for every serial port, and you can just count them up one to one to know what they are and can be. If the TCP numerical reference does not make sense to your brain and you want to use a different connectivity syntax, you can always use the physical port label or number, right? So port 01, port 02, port 048, port 052, for example. If that isn't consistent or easy enough for you, you can always use the label, the name or the host name of the device in question. And so the connecting syntax there is SSH-L, username plus, you do have to do the plus in these two cases, then the name of that label, and then the appliance IP address. Now, if your cup of IP addresses runneth over and you're not trying to ration the IP addresses that get consumed within your network, you could allocate a whole IPv4 v6 address to a serial port, and then any SSH to that IP would take you directly into that port, bypassing the appliance shell, the need to go to pmshell or anything like that. So that's what all of these 4 options do. They connect you straight into a serial port, and each of them represent a different way to get you there. Last but not least, I want to mention Telnet or Netcat. You can use these more basic forms of connectivity, but they are not recommended due to security reasons. Telnet is clear text, Netcat clear text. So any potential attacker sitting between the user and the appliance who is, let's say, logging TCP traffic could see all the commands, could see all the responses for this serial SSH or this Telnet 2 serial session. And so for that reason, out of security, we do not recommend using Telnet or Netcat, especially over the open internet. If you're going to first launch a VPN session to the data center and then do Telnet on top of that, that is better security, but using SSH is still the wisest approach. So unless someone tells you you must use Telnet or Netcat, you should plan to use SSH. It is the most secure, the best, and the most advised. But if you want to use Telnet, you can. You enable it in the serial port configuration, and you will need to edit the firewall of the appliance to allow that incoming rawTCP session. And in this case, you're connecting to a TCP port number similar to the TCP port numbers we looked at on the previous slide, except these are listening TCP port numbers starting in the 4000 range. So you would NC to the appliance IP and then 4000 and some number representing the physical serial port. In this case, 4006 takes me to serial port 6. Let's see this in action, shall we? Okay, the first thing we're going to do is access the appliance via the WebUI. So I'm just going to browse to it. Notice HTTPS, you must use HTTPS. And when you do so, it does bring you to this warning screen. And it looks scary, possibly. It's just letting you know that, hey, the certificate issuer is not recognized by your browser. And that's because the appliance issues a self-signed certificate. You can swap this for one signed by your corporate certificate authority, and that would eliminate this warning. You should do that for greatest security. But in the interest of today's video, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to log in as my root user. This is the default root user. I have changed the password. You must change the password on initial login. For everyday operations, though, you should not use root. You should use a user-specific account. When I log in, you can see it drops me onto the Access tab for serial ports. This would be exactly where I want to start launching serial sessions. And I'll just show this one to my Palo Alto firewall. So I'll just click Access Web Terminal. Okay, it takes just a couple seconds to connect, and I'm at the login prompt for my firewall. I don't remember my password at this moment, so I'm just going to close the tab, and it takes me back to where I was before. If I want to have a local SSH client connect to this asset, I can just click SSH Access. It's going to say, hey, this is going to download a connection string that would use a client like WinSCP or PuTTY or something else. And so I'm just going to open, right? And mine is set to use PuTTY. And you can see it's connecting to root plus port 6 at the appliance IP. And we saw that earlier in our slides. That's one of the ways to connect in directly to a port. You do see this warning about potential security breach. That's because every time I connect, a SSH key is saved, and if ever you factory reset the appliance, then it will have a new SSH key and could prompt you with a warning such as this. You will also see a similar warning the first time you connect to accept the SSH key from the appliance. I'm just going to click accept. Right, I'm logging in as root, so I need to supply the root password, like so, and I'm in that serial session at this point, just using my SSH client local to my PC versus the HTML5 viewer from here. And then if I want to or need to, I can terminate all SSH sessions from here, and if I need to access my serial port log, I do so by hitting the little droppy down arrow here, and I can access that port log as you see here. To configure the serial port, I come down here under Configure Serial Ports, and you can see my options for Autodiscovery, running, scheduling. You can see the log results from the last run of the Autodiscovery process. And then if I need to configure a serial port, I click on the red text hyperlink to that port. And then from here, I could do things like, rename. I can change the mode. I can change the pinout. I can change my baud rate. If I want a custom escape character that is not tilde. If I want to restrict the session to only a single user. If I want to allow rawTCP, I don't because it's insecure, right? Where I can configure my logging level. This is the recommended one. And then if I have IP addresses aplenty, then I could even add an IP alias here and tell it which IP interface to listen for incoming connections on. Right? So yeah, that's how to launch a serial session from the WebUI and how to configure a serial port from the WebUI. Next, we will look at doing the same thing from the CLI. In order to launch a serial session via the Opengear appliance, I'm going to show you just a few different ways to get in. First, I'm going to SSH using my root account. Again, this should be a user-specific account, but for the sake of today's demo, I'm going to use root. And then the appliance address, this could be an IP address, it could be a DNS name, just whatever addressing takes you to the appliance. And click enter, right? This is my standard login banner. I'm going to issue my password. And I'm at the appliance shell here. If I wanted to, I could do like cat space etc version, and it shows that I'm on firmware 25.10.0. And then if I want to access, or if I want to see a serial ports configuration, you could do this in a few different ways. Like you could see PM stats if you want to see like the serial port, its baud rate, any signal received or sent data, and then any signals, as I said, the request to send, clear to send, data terminal ready, data carrier detected, etc. These signals don't always tell you if something is physically connected. It kind of depends on if the device in question supports turning on these signals or not. But you can at least see if there's some transmitted or received data. And then from here, if I want to get into or see the configuration, we would do OGCLI export. And then to keep keep things simple, I'm going to pipe this and then grep it for ports. So it should just show me the serial ports configuration. And I can see that I've got a little bit more, right? First, I've got let me go to the top and we can kind of walk through this. Anyway, so here you can see this is the start of my serial port configuration. So port 0 is physical port 1. We can tell that by this label here, or sorry, by that physical reference, and then the label, that's the label it has detected from the device. Anyway, you can see how that port is configured, and then you can see it moved on to ports 1. So now this is serial port 2. Ports 2 is now serial port 3, and so on up to the higher number ports. So you can see this tops out at 33, which is the front lower USB. And then I've also got the other 8 USB ports on the back of the appliance, for example. Anyway, I've also got my my firewall ports for a given zone. This is zone 0, so that's the WAN zone. Zone 1, zone 2, or sorry, zone 1 is LAN. Zone 2, I think, is Lighthouse or cellular. Regardless, you can see those in the WebUI or just do an OGCLI export for firewall. And then I can see my local serial port, its behavior as well from this export. So that's how you could see the configuration from the CLI. And if you watched my previous video on initial configuration, I believe I show you how to edit the configuration. But if I now want to launch into a serial session, I can just do pmshell. I can see a menu of all my ports. And if I want to go into, let's say, port 6, I just type the number 6. And I'm in that session. If I want to go back to the menu, I press Shift-M. And hope that it was received by the appliance and not the end device. Sometimes it can not catch your tildes and it'll pass it as just something to be sent. And it can confuse it a little bit. I just did a tilde-M and you saw it brought me back to the menu. So the mention earlier that says, hey, tilde is required if you're on a Mac, sometimes even on Windows, right? So just keep that in mind. If the tilde trick didn't do what you needed it to, double it up and in it should. So you see it brought me back to the menu. I could just Control-C here to go back to the appliance shell, or I could do pmshell, oops, spell it right. I could go back into port 6, and then I can from here tilde and drop me back to the shell, which exits all the way out. So then at this point, I can log out of my SSH session, and that was one way to connect. The next way I want to connect is I'm going to do -L. I'm going to do my username of root, and then I want to connect to, let's just say, port 6. So port 6 like that. And then I don't need the @ I will just do the IP for the appliance. All right, same password. And you can see I'm already in serial port 6. I did not drop to the appliance shell, and I did not get to the pmshell menu or anything like that. And if I want to exit, I can tilde ... and it takes me all the way out of the serial session. So hopefully that makes sense. You saw in the slides the other ways of connectivity. Just wanted to give you this quick demo. So that's it for the demonstration. You've seen us configure serial ports. You've seen us launch SSH to serial sessions and get connected to fix or provision assets on that first day, that worst day, or every day. In some upcoming videos, you can see we'll dive deeper into some Lighthouse functionality around our connected resource gateway and how we access those IP management interfaces. Crucial to this will be the smart management fabric, and we'll talk about configuring and using that. And then hopefully a little sooner than later, I will also produce a video on how to harden the Opengear appliances according to our security hardening best practices guide, which you can currently find on portal.opengear.com under resources. It's one of the knowledge base articles. So with that, the real test of any network isn't when it's built, it's when it breaks. And at Opengear, we help keep your network running on the first day, worst day, and every day. So get familiar, plan for disaster, and plan to have Opengear in that disaster recovery plan so that those worst days are as minimally bad as possible, and make every day your best day. Thank you.